Mr. Rainwater, the other day, in true amateur form, I wake up, I take a shower, I brush my teeth, I put on my gym clothes, I go downstairs, I boot up the treadmill, and the very first thing I do is I talk to my Amazon Dot. And of course, I tell it to play some kind of music when I'm working out.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, I had chose that morning Marilyn Manson.
All right.
I asked it to play music by Marilyn Manson. And like all good technology, I got the response, "Sorry, I'm having trouble playing that station right now." And like any person in a particular mood, I said it again and got rejected again. And I kept trying that, and then finally I just pivoted. I'm like, all right, play Rob Zombie. No problem. So I go, as one does, I go on Twitter, and I'm about to start typing towards the Amazon help account just to bitch about it.
Yeah.
And I notice Marilyn Manson is trending on Twitter. And I'm like, that's an odd coincidence. What could possibly be going on?
Right.
And I click on it, and I'm not saying the two are related, but Marilyn Manson was being outed as a groomer, pedophile, abuser, something along those lines, where he had done some despicable things to multiple people. And people were coming forward, people of stature in the celebrity community, I guess you could say, were coming forward and speaking about their experiences with him. And I got to thinking that this was definitely a topic that needs to be discussed in terms of art. Now, I don't necessarily want to go into specifics about a particular artist or anything like that. I'm sure we'll reference some, just because it's the nature of a conversation. But I'm interested to know and discuss with you your thoughts on art versus the artist. Is there a separation between the two?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And also, I was just thinking, like, this is actually something I think we talked a little bit on the first episode we ever did, because in my mind, I think it's one of the greater ethical questions that we have. Going forward into the future, because there's our conception. We have a lot of conceptions of who the person of an artist is. And as we become more and more informed of the people who make art, the more we learn about they are human beings like everybody else and are as vulnerable to the same problems as anybody else who comes into possession of different forms of power. And we don't think of that often because for a long time we've had this conception of, the starving artist. So like somebody like Vincent van Gogh, he was an artist who everybody kind of sees him now in retrospect as this victim, this guy who never got recognized for his art, who never was recognized for what he was doing, what he was contributing to the overall scene at the time. And now we're in like this total inversion of it, where there are artists who become, in their own ways, they build empires. They have the kind of power you would have not even imagined artists having in the past. Even really famous artists, like, I was referencing Pablo Picasso not that long ago. He was wealthy, sort of. Like, he did well. But that wasn't initially the case, and it took him a long time to like gain that repertoire and to build that capital that, came with his name. And even then, a lot of those artists at that time still, like, their money was up and down because it was based on whoever was willing to pay the money for their paintings. So I would add to this notion, this idea of like, when we talk about art versus artists, I think there is an important historical context that needs to be taken into place too, because we exist in a very different time from the rest of history in regards to how artists are treated and how artists are received. Because even in the Renaissance, like Omega Chads like Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci, they were only successful because they had patrons who were bank financiers. And they were really the only people who knew about them. The public didn't really know about them. Leonardo da Vinci made paintings that were specifically designed for, like cafeterias that monks would be eating in. Those monks would be the only people seeing these paintings. You have exceptions, right? You have the Sistine Chapel. Everybody who went into the Sistine Chapel would see it, but that's only the people that were, I think that's Florence. I'm not really sure. I'm going to assume it's Florence, Italy. So only the people who lived in the city of Florence would have seen that. Nobody else was aware that was even going on at the time. So I'm just setting all this up to say what we conceive of as the persona of an artist is so very different in our day and age because previously we never had rock star artists. They did not exist. It was not even a conception, and the very beginnings of it may have happened at the beginning of our century. So that's all set up, right? Like
Okay.
let's get into the meat and potatoes of that, right? So our big problem now is that we do have artists, or I say problem. Let's say what we're trying to figure out is we now have artists who have a lot of money, who have a lot of social power, right? Who have a lot of, like Kanye West, for example, right? There's a man who has so much money, so much social power, is attempting to run for president of the United States. Such a thing, even 20 years ago, would be unthinkable, just unbelievable. But now we are entering into this period of time where the thought comes up and people go, okay, that could actually happen, right?
Yeah.
So now we're starting to enter in this place where we're starting to think of artists in this moral sense, right? Because artists now have an ability to reach out to more than just a city or more than just a couple of bank financiers or a couple of wealthy, hedge fund managers in New York City. Like this is, Kanye West, going back to that example, reaches millions of people. Marilyn Manson reaches millions of people. So now we suddenly are in this position where we start to wonder and think about what further influences do these people have on other human beings? And then on top of that, we get into, as we peer into their personal lives, that's when we start to do more and more of a judgment, right? So if Marilyn Manson's somebody who has these sort of who has done these sort of predatory behaviors in the past, does that make us in some way complicit in participating in that behavior? I'm not asking people to answer this question. I'm just posing what people think about. Do we give money to allow him to continue that behavior? Or is that actually 100% his responsibility? He was given this gift, this privilege.
Sure.
He has abused it, and so he has to figure out how to, redeem himself out of that. But those are really big questions, right? I'm not here to answer them necessarily. I'm here to or at least not at this moment. As we go further in the conversation, I'm curious if you have any responses to any of the stuff that I've been saying just now.
Well, I'm just, you brought up a very good point that we are exposing artists as flawed human beings, and I'm not a religious person these days, but I believe there's a quote. It's let ye without sin cast the first stone, or something of that sort.
Right.
And so the way I'm kind of looking at it is every great artist that has ever existed, I don't care if it's Marilyn Manson or Prince or whoever it may be. I'm not knocking on Prince, who knows. But what the point that I'm making is everybody has made some kind of major grave mistake in their life.
Yeah.
And people are acting as though up until they find out about it that it didn't happen. You are perfect until I know. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like the expression, it's only cheating if you get caught.
Right. That goes back to the idea of don't meet your heroes, or don't,
Yeah.
like, it's that idea of, we've talked about this a couple of times, where it's like, one of the big problems about having role models and idols is when you valorize them to such an extent, you are inevitably going to be disappointed. Like, it's guaranteed, absolutely guaranteed, because nobody is capable of meeting the ideal that we set up of each other. It's just not, I mean, I haven't seen it yet. I'll just say that. Because there are tons of artists who I deeply respect and admire. And I also know 100%, like, if you look into their history, you're going to find something that's just going to make me feel squeamish, like,
Right.
I love Frank Zappa. He's one of my favorite musicians. But I also know the more that I've learned about him as a person, I'm just like, he's a skis bag somewhere along the line. And he's somebody who is not, like, hiding it at all. That's him. And so it kind of comes to one of those things where it's like, it's easier to accept when somebody is upfront about their personality, because there's no surprises. It's like, go ahead.
There are. I would disagree with that. And there are two very prone examples. The one I'll lead with one very specific one, and then I'll close with a broader based one that's not so much lived up to today, but used to be quite a bit. Andy Kaufman, right off the bat, everything Andy Kaufman did was part of the act. When he was off stage, he was still, quote unquote, Andy Kaufman, the persona of on stage. So you really didn't know what you were getting. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
sure.
There are probably very few people who could tell you who Andy Kaufman really was, because the shtick never dropped for him. At least in terms of, the day-to-day, in terms of appearances and this and that. On a broader scale, back in the day, there used to be something called kayfabe in professional wrestling, in which it really wasn't well mainstream that wrestling was predetermined. It was more so, that kind of hush-hush behind the curtain kind of thing or whatever.
Yeah.
But wrestlers in real life would live up to their persona when they were at meet and greets or in the public eye or doing interviews or this or that. If they were a bad guy at that point on TV, in the storylines, they would be a bad guy in that interview, or they would, rip up a kid's autograph book, or, do all that kind of stuff. So sometimes the artist will continuously be that thing. Like, it's almost like they're trying to stay on brand. Like, the art starts to extend into interviews and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
That goes back to the signature thing, right?
Yes.
That becomes their signature. You're making a really good point, wherein, and this is a very interesting point to bring up in the art versus artist thing, because sometimes the artist does become their art to a certain extent. That was something that happened. That was something that happened with David Bowie, where as he would change personas, there was one point where one of the personas he changed into was sort of this weird crypto-fascist like thing that was making a lot of people in the UK really uncomfortable, because they were like, is he turning into this Nazi flirting, like, what's going on here? And then later on, David Bowie in an interview would revealed, like, yeah, at the time I was doing a lot of cocaine and was kind of out of my mind, and which is often the case for a lot of those artists. So that's the other part of it, right? Is that when you see artists acting a fool, there is often a correlation to some other aspect in their life, like substance abuse, or dealing with trauma or whatever. Because once again, kind of going back to David Bowie, something that he said recently, or not recently, he said in an interview I watched recently that I thought was really interesting, was that artists are a weird bunch. We're kind of like, I shouldn't say this as a generalization, but often artists are dysfunctional in some way, because making art is not like a functional, rationalizable thing that you do to live in the world, right?
I was legitimately going to make that point. I was going to say, I don't know. I almost feel like being a perfect person would make you a terrible artist. Like a
Yes.
lot of great art comes from mistakes and flaws and self-examination and conflict with personal demon. Like most of the greatest stuff that we've seen, like I'm not talking about craftsmanship or skill, like, you know, drawing a straight line has nothing to do with whether or not you beat your wife. But in terms of the thematic premises and what you're saying and the philosophical messages that you might be portraying, I think innately all of these people, whoever they may be at the time, know what they're doing is wrong and are struggling with it. And sometimes they'll find some kind of therapy by getting it out in art. It's interesting because I think a lot about these days. A lot of people, when they think about Freud, they think about the whole philosophy that he did where it's like, oh, everyone's trying to fuck their parents. Yeah. Like, you know, most men are looking for their mother in their wife, or vice versa with daughters and fathers. But there's another theory that I believe it was him that brought forward, which was it's like, I forget what it's particularly called. Forgive me, maybe you know, Rainwater, but it's like the destruction syndrome or something like that, where it's like, in order to create, you must destroy. Like, it's just as powerful as a motivation to create. There is just as powerful motivation for someone to destroy. And I sometimes feel like artists are really in tune with that more so than other people. Yeah. And sometimes it comes out of them onto themselves, onto other people. Like, there's a lot of people who are self-destructive, like you talked about substances and this and that. Like, they self-destruct because it's like you said, they become the art, and it's like they need to, that everybody's praising them, you know what I mean? Like, you get fans who are just rabid about, you know, oh my god, you're my idol. And then you have record people who are like telling you everything you're making is gold. And I think like something clicks in an artist's brain where it's like, that I'm too perfect right now. I'm going to fall off of this unless I fuck up. So if I'm going to fuck up, I'm going to do it on my terms and fuck up the way I feel like I need to stab myself. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. I mean, that was kind of off the rail a little bit in the example about to use, but that was kind of the case with Elvis, where it was like he was surrounded by all these yes people that it was so easy to set up to like get into drug abuse, and never, you know, like he wasn't managing any of his money. He wasn't managing like any of his tours. That was being managed outside of him. So he was kind of being kept in this. This is another thing, actually. This is the other aspect of this that people often overlook, is all the people surrounding the artist, especially as they become famous. Yep. That has a huge impact on their behavior, and often will contribute to you know, those behaviors that we will criticize, right, and be, you know, shaken by. So I'm going to kind of take this topic a little bit, because I think we want to get back sort of to the main point, which is, but how does that affect the art itself, right?
Yes. The
thing that we appreciate, right? Sometimes we appreciate the artist as much as the art. Sometimes we appreciate the art, or I'm sorry, sometimes we appreciate the artist more than the art a lot of the time. Like Andy Warhol might have been one of those kind of artists where I think people might have appreciated the artist way more than the art, because it's kind of bland art, really, ultimately, long term. And what we wanted was the signature. But anyway, the point is, and kind of going back to something we talked about in the first episode, there are a lot of movies that I like and enjoy that are by directors who, you know, if you look into their personal lives, kind of messed up, or like they were clearly not having a good day a lot of the time. But I have
I had a feeling you're talking about Kubrick right now.
Oh yeah, but there are others. Like, there are other directors for sure, right? Or other just artists and actors in general.
Yeah, you could throw a rock in Hollywood and you'll hit a scumbag. Absolutely, there's no doubt about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is an interesting point. Like, the monster that is Harvey Weinstein, right? There are a lot of movies that were funded by his company that They're
Sure.
good movies.
Yep.
Like a lot of Tarantino movies funded by Weinstein.
Yeah.
Does that make the movies themselves bad? Does it make, like, where in the chain do you say morally I cannot participate?
Mm-hmm.
And that is like that's the question that I think is hanging on everybody's mind, right? Because we ask ourselves, was
If we're
I
complicit?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, yes, Harvey Weinstein might have made money from ticket sales to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So did Quentin Tarantino. So did all the actors who worked on that film. So did all the staff. Production staffs for movies are gigantic. This is one of our biggest questions in our age, is this, does the one bad apple rot the whole barrel?
Mm-hmm.
And if we are held to the standards of our worst, how can any of us possibly thrive? And that's the question that I kind of keep finding myself asking, because this is the big moral this is a moral paradox or conundrum that we're kind of faced with right now, because we are constantly being approached or horrified by people who act in ways that, we don't want to see in the world. But at the same time, our survival oftentimes will be complicit or will be attached to that. Right. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts in regard to sort of that paradox or that conundrum that I'm speaking of right now.
It's really difficult for me, because in a world, I mean, especially if you go on Twitter, which, everybody's ready to pop off on Twitter, but you don't want to be necessarily an apologist for someone who may not be seeking forgiveness for their actions, especially when it comes to art. There are some who maybe do feel that way, and there's others who feel entitled. I kind of tend towards pitying those people one way or the other, simply because they either don't know, or something happened to them, or they just weren't, as my mama would say, they weren't raised right to know what they were doing is wrong, and there's some kind of circumstance in their life that they can't comprehend that their actions were wrong, or maybe they genuinely are struggling with a demon and they want forgiveness. It's like a drug addiction. You know what I mean? I'm not saying that they're similar in nature, but there are people can get screwed up, and there's so many factors that can contribute that we don't understand yet in terms of psychology and this and that. I tend to look at it as a piece of art is kind of, and this applies to other topics as well. I think I've kind of touched on this in the past. Art to me is like a child. And I'm not equating it to my actual newborn child that's upstairs, because I would die for that kid. I don't think I would die for digits. But I don't it's what's the expression? What's the sins of the father are cast upon the son, or something like that. You know what I mean? I can draw that line where it's like, okay, I separate things, so because there are things that from that art that can contribute to me. If there's a pedophile making a movie about pedophilia, it's tough to watch that, because they might be making an argument in favor of pedophilia, and I know I'm not in favor of pedophilia. I want to be closed-minded. Do you know what I mean? Like it's one of those times where you want to draw a line and say, I'm not open to hearing an argument on behalf of this. Yeah. And at the other time, I'm thinking to myself, well, as an artist myself, or as a human being, I should be trying to expose myself to every point of view possible, because maybe if I don't agree with it, I can still wrap my head around it and understand it, and I will be able to respond in my art some way that can grow or progress civilization from a philosophical point of view, a thematic point of view, a storytelling point of view. But there's a weird line that I draw, because like someone who's a rapist or a sexual assault person, it's hard for me to watch something that they're in once I know that they've done that thing. It perverts their performance. Or their work in general, and I'm looking for signs of that nature of them in everything
Right.
that's doing. Like, I know that they wrote this movie. So when this scene happens where the girl slips a roofie into the guy's thing, is that them making a case? You know what I mean? Like, it
Yeah.
starts, it's perverting the art in a sense. So it's almost like damned if you do, damned if you
Yeah.
don't. And
Yeah, I would follow up. I want to follow up that question too. Do you think that companies have a moral obligation to keep people from consuming that material that features people who have done, you know, those sort of acts?
we're seeing it right now, kind of with Disney severing ties with the whole Gina Carano situation
Yeah.
for Star Wars, which is interesting. You also saw it back when Kevin Spacey
Yeah.
was quote unquote outed. They replaced him. There was a movie coming out in like 2 months, and they delayed it by an extra month or something like that, and they forked over an extra couple $1 million to go back and reshoot the movie with Christopher Plummer instead of him.
Yeah.
But the thing that pisses me off about that is, it's like they said, it's like this with every situation. People knew. There were people behind the scenes who
Right.
already knew this, and they were trying to get away with it. And I almost feel like Kevin Spacey, Marilyn Manson, yes, they are responsible for their own actions, but there are people behind the scenes who enabled those actions.
Yeah.
So they can continue to profit off of them, that get out of this scot-free. The agencies, the studio execs, you know what I mean? Like, there are people who fucking know, and they're not doing anything, and they're not being held responsible for allowing those actions to continue. Now, I'm not necessarily blaming victims in this case. It's one thing to be dealing with the actual act being done to you. It's another thing to be known about it and sweep it under a rug or look the other way or whatnot like that. So I don't know how we get past all this. You know what I'm saying?
No, I
Like,
don't know, because it's like, because if you go absolutist about it, it's like you just clean out the whole thing. And I don't
Hollywood's
feel like
gone.
that's,
Yeah, there's
yeah,
nobody left.
I don't feel like that's a solution necessarily, although it's like open job opportunities for all of us, I guess. But
Exactly. But then it's the wheel starts turning all over again, and then it's like, Andrew Casarco was friends with a pedophile. Like, oh my God, how come he hasn't apologized for this? Well, what if I did apologize for it 6 years ago, or I severed ties with that friend, and I don't talk to him anymore, and this and that? Like, do I need to constantly apologize just because someone just now found out about something that I did in the past? Like, and it'll get dug up. Everything that you do now is gonna get found. I have live journals from when I was in high school, and crazy homophobic, because at that point in time, that's the kind of, and like you talked about before, the environment I was surrounded with. There was a lot of people around me, guys that I was friends with, that were just very, very anti-gay, and that was kind of the world at that time. Like, the world has come a long way in terms of acceptance of LGBTQ communities since I was a kid. But when I'm a kid and I'm popping off on the internet, you know what I mean? Like, that's gonna get dug up if I.
That's the important part of it. That the
Right, but that people won't care. You know what I mean? And then it's like you have to. Once someone can find something to laud over you, they'll never let it go as long as they can. Like, I'm waiting for the day for a celebrity to fuck up, not majorly. I'm not talking rape or assault or murder or pedophilia or anything like that, but something bad, but not so bad that it's unforgivable. And then hire like a private detective to find out dirt on all the people shitting on him on Twitter constantly, just so they can throw a little bit back on them. Because at some point, we all need to realize that we're all fucked up.
Well,
and
I
that
think
we all make mistakes.
I think that's going to be the next step of social media in the future. I really do, because there's no way that any of this, it's like none of this can continue on this course for forever. It always evolves into something new. It inevitably evolves into something new. And I think you've just pinpointed out, like, the next step of things where the playing field becomes more evened out, and we start to see more obviously just how human we all are, because ultimately we are all very, very fucking human. And I would. It's interesting though, because I would. There are extreme cases where I would
Sure.
say, I really can't separate the art from the artist in this one. Really great example would be, let's say that you enter into an art museum somewhere and you find some lovely watercolors of 19th century German townscapes. And you're thinking to yourself, oh, these are really lovely. These are so detailed
I know
and
where you're
looked
going
at
with this too.
with such love. And then you look at the bottom right hand corner of the painting and you see the initials A. Hitler.
I knew
And you
that's where
think
you were
to
going.
yourself, well, maybe there was an Arnold Hitler. His cousin. You know?
Yep.
And you go ask the curator, and the curator tells you, no, that's Adolf Hitler. We have it on display as this, whatever. They explain some sort of thing about time and memory or whatever, and
Yeah.
you suddenly realize, like, oh, okay, there are horrible, horrendous people who are, genocidal maniacs who also involve themselves in art the same way as anybody else. And I feel like in certain context of what you were saying earlier, this goes back to art begins from a inner child place, and there is an alternative universe, where this genocidal maniac was just a realist painter in the German,
He was the
landscape.
Gandhi of that dimension. He was like
Yeah.
so anti-violence, it wasn't even funny. Yeah.
But what happened in our reality is that for various reasons that all of them are horrifying when you look into the history surrounding it, it became something terrible, right? And
no, go ahead. I'll let you finish your thought.
I didn't have a thought.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm curious to know, because here's the real gimmick or the kicker of this is, would the museum be displaying that art if he hadn't murdered millions of people? It goes to the question, like, I was going to bring up, and this is a perfect way to segue into it. Someone like, I believe it was John Wayne Gacy, who in prison, after he was arrested, started doing paintings, and now those paintings sell for millions of dollars. Like, people want to buy it, and it's not because it's a good painting. It's because he was a fucking crazy serial killer, and there's this weird attraction to having something that he created, not because it's good, not because it has something to say or it's philosophically challenging or anything like that, but because he fucking murdered people. And like, that's a question that you have to ask yourself, is like, why? I mean, now granted, he's dead, so there's no profit he can make off of that now, but should that art just be burned, or does it need to be passed on? Or
I will see your position and raise that even further. Alan Moore actually talks about this to a certain extent in his graphic novel they did with, I think, Eddie Campbell. Forgive me for not remembering the artist's name, but From Hell is a book about the Jack the Ripper murders. And in the book, he basically lays down his theory about who Jack the Ripper was. And it's like, there's an incredible amount of note-taking that goes into it, incredible amount of research that goes into it. I'm not going to get into that part. It's interesting.
Alan Moore is a fucking...
He's me. So,
yes, in all the best ways.
So one of the themes that comes up in this book is there's a scene where we get to see how the public is reacting to these Jack the Ripper murders. Because there's a letter released that the police come across that is assumedly from Jack the Ripper. What happens is the public starts writing their own Jack the Ripper letters because they want
fan fiction,
like trying to take on the celebrity that Jack the Ripper is starting to create, because he is, like, historically what Alan Moore is trying to set up is this is sort of the beginning of a meme. And so Jack the Ripper, I think his position was that Jack the Ripper might have been one of the first modern memes in our society, where there
Now,
was this
hold on, time out. Before,
yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but did this actually happen, or this was just artistic license he was using?
This I cannot say with certainty. I'm going to go with I'm going to go with the confidence that this is backed up by his research. I did not
Okay.
read that. I did not read all that part in the back of the book.
Okay.
So I don't know. I don't know. But the way that it was written was very much he was attempting to be extremely historically in line. And so I could be totally wrong, but
Sure.
I think even on its own, it stands as an example to what you were saying with how people perceive and try and replicate what they view as power in their lives. So sometimes that's productive, right? Like a young Andrew Casarco watches Jurassic Park at the age of what, 6, 7? I don't.
1993. I was born in '86, so about 7 or 8ish, somewhere
Sure.
in there.
Then wants to make his own movies, right?
Right.
A 13-year-old somebody else like sees see what was the name of that serial killer that you were talking about earlier? Was that Wayne Gacy?
John Wayne Gacy, the clown
Okay.
guy. Yeah.
And suddenly that gets into his brain, and he becomes a copycat serial killer himself, and which is a common thing that happens where you have copycats of
Sure.
of serial killers. And that, like I was trying to say, there is an aspect of human nature that I think we often don't want to acknowledge because it freaks us the fuck out, and I think
Mm.
it's rational that it freaks us the fuck out
Sure.
that we as animals mimic things that we see culturally in society and in behaviors from people around us. And this is like, this is stuff that you can neurologically back up, and sociologically back up. But on top of that, there are aspects of our personalities that, from very young ages, we imprint stuff that we see around us from the behaviors of our parents, the behaviors of
Sure.
our peers.
Yep.
All these things make this giant gumbo of a person's personality.
Yep.
And what's so difficult is being able to parse between, on the one hand, having mercy and compassion, on the other hand, having the willingness to say, fuck no, right? Like,
Free will. Yeah.
right. Like that is, I feel like I said this before, but I feel like that is like the topic of our decade, because we're trying to figure out how do we participate and behave with each other, knowing the animal that we are as human
Right.
beings, right? Because there are just aspects of ourselves that we are not always 100% fully in control of, whether or not
Yeah.
we're aware of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Little unconscious tics, subconscious things, and they're usually things that aren't a big deal. But sometimes, for some people, it becomes serial killer territory. It becomes genocidal maniac territory. It becomes,
Sure.
rapists or abuser or all these other things. And my general response to that is we have to figure out how to mediate these things through proper mental health, which is, in our country, it's a little bit tricky, right? In terms of having the money to do it and whatever. Still, there are plenty of people who come into lots of money and lots of power who don't take that in. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They don't make the most of that privilege that they have to heal and to change and to grow. And I have a huge appreciation for artists who grow and who I've seen, start from one place and end up in a totally other place.
Sure.
Going back to David Bowie, young David Bowie to old David Bowie, completely different person, because he's gone through all these different metamorphoses, and that became part of his overall body of work, right? But
Yeah.
I don't know if I have a point beyond that.
Well, I think the real question that we need to get down to is as a society, do we have hard lines of what is forgivable and what is not? I mean, and 9 times out of the 10, the thing is forgivable if we choose, if the person is seeking forgiveness and making active attempts to not undo, but to prohibit that from reoccurring, whether it's in themselves or in someone else. Like I know, for example, Kevin Hart, he made some pretty nasty comments on Twitter, which, it's debatable whether or not he was trying to tell a joke, but about if his son ever asked for a dollhouse, that he would say, no, that's gay, and then smash a dollhouse over his head. It's debatable whether or not he was trying to be, what's the word I'm looking for here? Offensively comedic or controversial comedy, kind of like that, or if he was serious. And he apologized for it, and then he had to apologize for it again, and then he got the Oscars, and then people made a big stink about it again, and he had to apologize about it again, and then he stepped down. And I think the problem with it was there was no effort from his point of view other than to say, I'm sorry, I was wrong, to undo what he had done by saying that. Do you know what, does that make sense? Like, there needs to be demonstrable, practical, tangible effort on the person who committed the wrongdoing to undo or prevent it from happening again in the future. So you look at an actor like Danny Trejo. Danny Trejo, if I'm not mistaken, was in prison for some pretty horrendous stuff. I might be wrong. I know he was in prison. I'm not entirely sure what for, but I can't tell you anybody who's boycotting Danny Trejo because you know what I mean? Like, he served his time. He went to jail and he doesn't do that thing anymore. You look at someone like Tim Allen, who in the 80s was arrested for being a cocaine dealer, and then the next thing you know, he's Santa Claus. He did his time. So the question is, but then like I'm pretty sure Chris Brown went to jail, but he is still kind of spit on in certain circles amongst people because I think he went to jail, but I don't know. And, he said his apologies, but some people might have felt like he did it because he felt like he had to and not because he was genuinely sorry. So like there's this weird thing where we as a society have to decide what we choose to forgive, when we choose to forgive, how we choose to forgive, what our terms are. And there's got to be room amongst the people who did not commit the crime or whatever it may be, to let the other people that they're next to, so fans, imagine a crowd full of fans. It's that idea that you were talking about where it's absolutism, where one person in that entire stadium says, I don't like this artist because of this. And they look at the person next to them and say, you don't like them either, right? And if the person next to them has said, well, he's donated millions to charity to do that, and he's seen a therapist, and now his work is about helping people in that particular situation that he put other people in, and he's apologized, and even the person that he offended, like physically or assaulted or whatever like that, he's gotten his apology was accepted by them, like, and the person in the crowd is like, no, I forgive him, and then the person who's still very much against it goes, well, fuck you. Then it's like, well, what are we even doing here? Like, why are you in this stadium? Is it just because you're angry and you want to boycott this person? Like, how is that positive? How are you bringing positivity to the movement? So we need to start understanding not just the artist, but the rest of the fandom needs to start communicating with each other and being open-minded in terms of people are going to have that different reaction to how a person grows, how an artist grows. we're about 45 minutes into it, so I wanted to take this in a different direction, maybe that you weren't
Sure.
expecting. But it's kind of what I was kind of tilting towards this earlier with John Wayne Gacy, which is it good or right when the artist makes the art popular? It's kind of like what you were talking about with maybe with Andy Warhol a little bit with the signature and stuff like that. So I'm looking more at it like a position of I'm a straight white guy and I see film festivals that I want to submit to, and they offer discount codes to someone who's in the LGBTQ community, or there's black only film festivals or this or that. And part of me instinctively pushes back immediately before my thought processes kick in. And I say, well, that's not fair. That's putting the art before, or the artist before the art. Shouldn't we all be judged on an equal basis? Shouldn't it be blind? Shouldn't you look at the art and say, wow, this is a really good story. This is good characters. This is good structure, craftsmanship, whatever. As opposed to, oh, this person come from an impoverished community. This person is, frowned upon by certain circles of society or this or that. We should amplify those voices because as the I don't want to call it a catchphrase, but it's the slogan goes, representation matters. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're not exposed to certain types of art or artists, I should say, then you never really have a chance to understand them and get to know them. So is there benefits to putting the artist before the art in terms of the art versus artist conflict? What do you think about that? Is there a time when the artist should be the reason why the art is notable?
That's a really heavy question, because as I'm thinking about it, one of my first initial responses is we appreciate art because we see something being communicated by a fellow artist that responds with us. And so, part of my optimism when I see people doing things that involve more involvement of like the representation of a person, right? Like what particular background they come from, race, gender, etc. What I think about is like, well, I would like to know, like, how do they perceive art and art production, right? Mm-hmm. Like, how do they make? What kind of movie will they make? Will it be different? Will it be similar? What are, compare and contrast, right? Yeah. I don't think that it's like a negative thing, and I don't think that it has any necessarily any problems. What I think, the thing that I always kind of wonder about is, could it become sort of totalizing, where it's like that becomes the only way that we enjoy art, by saying like, oh, well, this director is here, a woman, or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, right, where we start to like parse out like who's allowed to do how many movies and all that stuff. That's the part where I start to get like a little bit weirded out. But we're not really in that phase, and I don't think we'll ever be in that kind of phase. A little bit there, because I remember if it wasn't last year, or it might have been last year. It might have been last year or the year before. The Academy Awards was talking about the Best Director category, and I just remember, I forget who it was. I want to say it was Natalie Portman, but I'm not entirely sure. Yeah. But when they were announcing them, they were like at the end of announcing who all the nominees were, they wrapped it up by saying, "Congratulations to all those men." And the insertion of like the word "all" was very I don't want to say protesty, but it was inciting. It sounds very passive aggressive.
Yeah, but it was one of those things where I think that whoever the woman was that did it, I want to say it was Natalie Portman, but I could be wrong, was, I don't want to say behaving, but they were acting professional, because it was a form of protest in a time and place where you know, you don't want to pull attention necessarily completely and like act like a child, but as an adult, you want to make sure everyone notices.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like, I don't want to call it passive aggressive. I want to call it like just low key protest.
Sure.
But, you know, they raised a valid point was that there are no females being nominated in that particular thing. Now, we're going to get into this in a future podcast because the topic of contesting art, where we put art into fucking battlefields with each other, comparing what's good and what's bad, is a whole topic in itself.
That's like a multi-series topic because that's something that I think about a lot.
But the point that I wanted to get was that she was very upset about the fact that there were no female directors who had been nominated.
Sure.
And you look at something like a couple years ago, there was Oscars So White, where there wasn't a single African American nominated in multiple major categories, and it was like, yeah, they got a fucking point. Like, this actor was way better than that actor. Like, I like that. Well, again, I'm already getting into it, but I enjoyed this actor more than I enjoyed that actor, and I think they did a more skilled performance or whatever it may be. But those points were raised, and then it becomes the question of, well, do we need to have one black person, one Hispanic person, one Muslim person, one woman, one man, one straight guy, one gay guy, one trans person, one Asian actor, one... And you know what I mean? And then it's like, okay, it comes down to it. In my point of view, and this is how I usually approach things, when I see stuff like that, instinctively, it's hard, especially as an artist, when you get rejected. Like, so to not even be allowed in the club because of who you are or whatever is fucking maddening. And I understand that many of the people who are getting these advantages now weren't allowed in the club for the longest time because of who they were.
Right.
So my once cooler heads prevail, my way of approaching it just becomes be fucking undeniable. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because there's a point when, as an artist, and this is how I look at it, if I don't get into a film festival, which happened to me 3 times this weekend, I got rejected. I get mad and I get sulky and this and that, and then I turn around and I'm like, no, fuck you, Andrew. Get better. Like, be undeniable to the point where they, like, everyone who's on the judging committee stops looking at the fact that you're a white guy and is just like, oh, this is really fucking good. We have to have this one. And they forget about whatever qualifications that they may be looking for diversity or this or that. They look at my work, and my work stands above me. And that's the kind of motivating thing that I go after it with. So I guess what I'm getting at is, when it comes to art versus an artist, I kind of feel like the end-all, be-all is not so much us right now, but time in general. They say that the saying goes, the best things stand the test of time.
Right.
So in the future, when all of the hype, and that's what it is a lot of the times, hype around someone's misdoings or how terrible they were has fallen away.
That is that little thing that you were saying about hype, that is another interesting aspect of this that I feel like is worth pointing out, is that there have been a lot of times where people become controversial. Now, not necessarily every time, but there are a lot of times where people become controversial for something that they have done, something that they have said, that it ends up exploding their career. Yes. Yeah. All the fucking time. And one of the weirder examples in my mind was Jordan Peterson, who was like this psychologist who worked at Toronto, some college in Toronto.
He was Canadian,
and like protested this bill about the use of language regarding gender, and he became infamous during this period of time. And this is not that long ago, but it feels like decades now.
We've been through so much
because of the nature of the internet. And so he now, because of that, has entered this new phase where he, because of it, has almost become untouchable in a sense. And this is kind of, I think about this a lot, and I try not to I try not to get conspiratorial about it, but sometimes I think, do these things come out as ways to promote people and we're just not aware of it?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because
Yep.
the cynic in me looks at this and goes, this happens too frequently, too often, too like.
Uh,
What are you
I'm Captain Expression tonight, but there's no such thing as bad press.
right?
That's the saying, right? So it's like as long as and it you know, it's gonna be that saying is universal, where it's like
Yeah.
In pro wrestling they say it doesn't matter if you get cheered or booed as long as the crowd isn't silent.
Well,
Like,
and that plays into one of the greater, or not, I don't know if greater is the right word, but like one of the more infamous examples being also the president of the last 4 years, right, is somebody who rode that infamy hype train all the way to the top. There is like it was one of those things where he could be shat on so much and it just made him stronger, like some kind of like sci-fi movie monster.
I had a theory, and everyone laughed at me way before the 2016 election. I had a theory, and it turned out to be right. I was running around, and everybody called me a Trumper for this, and I wasn't. But I was trying to warn people that they were shitting on him too much in terms of the media and the general social media and whatever it may be.
The old phrase, don't feed the trolls. You don't feed the trolls.
It became to the point where, and there's like super cuts of this on the internet where everyone was like, he's not going to be president. He's not going to be president. He's not going to be president. And I'm like, you motherfuckers just turned him into an underdog. Like, he's a fucking millionaire who's got all this shit. He's got everything going for him and da-da-da-da-da. And you have made him the underdog in this fight. That's why people turned around and voted for him. People loved that underdog story, and it didn't matter how much of an asshole he was or how controversial he was. It was that idea of, oh, he can't win? Oh, yes, he can. I just want to see, like, people would vote, and this is ridiculous, but people do vote for the weirdest of fucking reasons because they wanted to see the underdog win. And I tried to tell people, I'm like, that's what fucking happened.
A less political version of that right now would also be Dogecoin, which is like a meme where people are like, oh, that'll never hit $1. And then everybody's like, well, let's fucking find out.
Yeah, but it's that mindset where people and it's kind of that, I think, because everybody deep down feels that innately in themselves that no one's rooting for them. And if they feel like they can contribute to another underdog, whether it be Dogecoin or Donald Trump or whatever, then there's a chance for them. And that's where I think that stems from. And I think that a lot of going back to the art versus artist thing, and this is where the downside comes into a lot of these guys and girls, who maybe it's not so much girls. The girls don't seem to fuck up as much as guys, but there's an egotism that comes along with success where it's like, oh, I could fuck up and I'll be back. Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's so many people who get to that point where it's like, oh, I'll be back. You look at Louis C.K. though. He's not back. No. He's tried a couple times to come back.
But it'll probably be years. It'll be years when the
hype has gone down.
Yes, exactly.
Right. And that's the thing, though, and this just goes back to the point I was trying to make, which was the art stands above the artist. Once the artist is gone, like it becomes about the art and not about the artist anymore. So as long as the art has something worthwhile to contribute, I feel like it's worthy. And that's just my personal point of view. So whenever I watch something, whether it be a Woody Allen movie or listen to a Marilyn Manson song or whatever like that, I understand that they have done terrible things as people. And maybe they are things that I personally can't forgive.
Yeah.
But I look at the art separately because the art is the child. It is the offspring. And I don't think that people, including artists, are one thing. You are not your worst mistake. You are not. You know what I mean? There are terrible people in prison who have generally who maybe have done terrible things, but then they, have also done really great things. It comes down to that thing too, where it's one of those debates. It's not even just artists now. We're talking about political figures. You're looking at people like Christopher Columbus, who, people are protesting against having a day named after him because of the things that he did to indigenous people. And then you have to start wondering, well, which one was more worthwhile? The contributions that he made to humanity and civilization, or the detractions that he made. And I personally, I don't know necessarily if what the answer is to that. I know what my answer is to that. I don't feel like I need to say it right now because everyone has their own opinion about the matter. But the contribution remains the same. It's going to stay in the history books. And it doesn't matter if you include the detraction. Both of those things got us to where we are now.
Yeah, that's the ultimate truth of it. And I think a lot of I don't want to use the word outrage as much as I want to use the word like I'm trying to figure out what a better word to use is, like the reaction, like the fearful, surprised reaction that comes from, as people learn about history, because I think in this moment of time, we now have more access to historical information than at any point in time in human history. And we have
alternative information than what we were just provided in a textbook at school. It's like, you can't read one book on a particular subject and know everything. But if you read 6 books with 6 different perspectives, and that comes back to our representation.
You can't properly participate in history without having sort of a schizoid like mindset around, because you are now dealing with conflicting points of information. And I think that is part of the thing that a lot of people shirk back from, is the reality of, I cannot know with absolute certainty, like, the good and evil of a person. I have to now deal with the reality that people are both of those things together, because that is human nature. Like, that is like the really uncomfortable part of our reality. And I think over time, I like to hope over time that we'll become more comfortable with it, and we'll be able to have more nuanced, ways of perceiving these things, such that, when we start to learn about mistakes people make in the future, we'll have a process, like societally, we'll have a process that we can like go through those stages of grief and like work through that, instead of just like, raising our arms up and trying to immediately put out the fire, because it's not really not a fire that you can immediately put out. It's a lifetime. You know what I mean? It's it's a person's lifetime, and societally it's a lifetime too. But
I mean, it can be examined in so many different ways. It's one of those things where it's like, well, I didn't know that Chick-fil-A donated to anti-LGBTQ groups, but I like the chicken, and I've bought the chicken there for so long.
Yeah.
And now it's like, oh, do I continue to buy chicken from there? Do I still go buy chicken from there? Or they've stopped doing that now, but do they still believe? You know what I mean? Like it comes down to the point where I think people need to. I think a lot of the people who are, and I don't say this in a negative manner, but the people who are closed-minded about forgiveness have issues personally with confronting their own faults.
Oh yeah.
That's just a personal opinion of my own.
Only
because it's taken a while for me to come to terms with my own personal faults as a human being. Like, and that's when I started turning parts of my life around, where I would be able to fight against things like depression. Was when I was able to admit that I was wrong to myself and understand that things weren't okay, and that I needed to take steps to undo the things that I had done and to prevent myself from doing them again. So I think, like we were talking about, the societal process of approaching things, I think we need to start re-examining the Twitter lynch mob cancel culture kind of mindset where it's like, well, you're canceled, you're done, and cut off. I understand that to a point where it's like, okay, I'm not going to continue to support this particular thing.
Yeah.
I think that the most important part of that should be, I'm not going to continue to support that person right now. I think that needs to be the addendum.
Yeah.
Where it's like, I think we need to take a step back, and everybody, including the fandom and the artists, need to both step back from each other and say, hey, we all got to work on something right now. The fandom needs to understand, you know, that you're not a human person, and we need to work on ourselves and grow our minds around accepting that. And the artist needs to step back and say, I did something that was wrong. I was enabled or privileged or whatever it may be to commit these crimes or faults or whatever it may be. And I need to undo those things. I need to fix those things about me. I need to reassess. I need to make amends for whatever it is. And I think the problem is when you draw that hard line in the sand where it's like, no, you're done. You're dead. You're gone forever. You give someone nowhere to go. And it's like, well, it's either this is me now, where they end up doubling down on that horrible flaw of themselves, or they kill themselves. Like that becomes the rock in the hard place that it is. It's like, okay, if I'm a racist because I'm a straight white guy or a white guy, then if I'm always going to be a racist, then I should just go join the KKK, or I should kill myself. Those are my two options. And if you don't give someone the room to say, okay, maybe I've done racist things, but I'm not a racist, then I have the ability now to do things that are not racist and undo those things that I did were racist or whatever like that. Like that is like, we need to give each other the room to step back and take a minute and breathe and address the faults, I guess you could say.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's important with an artist, especially when an artist is, they're faulting for a purpose. And I think that's the big thing about an artist is 9 times out of the 10, most artists, there's a line between artists and entertainers. An artist is very introspective. They're constantly looking at themselves because they know nothing else. They don't understand. I think this is the truth about artists. We don't understand people. We're in the process of trying to understand ourselves, and we're trying to understand people at the same time. And when we find something that connects, we'll ride it to the ground. We'll ride it as far as we can so that we can start trying to build a bridge to us and acceptance within community. And when we ride it too far, it's like the road to hell was paved with good intentions. Man, I'm full of expressions tonight. That's when shit fucks up, and we have to reverse the car and take another exit. And maybe it's going to take us a while to get back on the highway. I'm full of analogies too. But we can't just drive the car off a cliff. Right. And that's the way it's got to be. There's got to be forgiveness.
I agree 100% with what you're saying. And this is something that you said a couple of times I really appreciate and have thought about a lot, which is like when you back somebody into a corner, you don't give them any options. And we worry about the animal nature of our humanity. If you want to find it out as soon as possible, put somebody in a corner, see what happens. Yep. And that is part of the volatility of our current age is so many people finding themselves in positions where they're put into corners, and so they don't have anywhere else to go. They don't have anywhere
double
else.
Down.
Yes.
Yeah, or they self-destruct.
And so if we want a better society, we have to figure out how to forgive in some way, how to move on, how to allow time to heal, how to allow people to heal. And it requires time. And that's difficult because we're all very impatient as people. Right?
Especially in modern times. The internet and our connectivity of instantaneousness has made us all very impatient. So it's, but at the same time, it hurts too because you can't forgive someone instantaneously.
No.
Trust and forgiveness do take time. Yeah. It's just one of those things, and we all need to breathe.
100%. Yeah. Absolutely.
So we're gonna wrap this up. I hope this has been somewhat constructive to the artists out there. I just want to, and I want to say this to fandom, to anyone who's listening. This is the most important thing for you to take away from today's podcast. Your favorite artist, I don't care who they are. Don't care who they are. They have fucked up
Right.
in whatever line you have drawn in your life where you think there's an unforgivable sin. I promise you, they have flirted, skirted, danced, or crossed that line. Maybe not even just once, maybe multiple times.
Right.
And you don't know it yet. It has not come out. It may not come out until after you're dead. You may be collecting things from a comic book that was created by a pedophile who molested his own parents or something crazy. And you don't know it yet. You are consuming something, whether it be the grocery from the grocery store, they were stacked by someone who dealt drugs, and maybe you lost a family member to a drug overdose. But you ate a banana that was put onto a tray by someone who was a drug dealer or is a drug dealer. And you need to understand that just because they dealt drugs, that particular banana is not poisonous to you. That's what you need to take away from tonight, I think, is my point of view. Is that the product, the offspring of a human being is its own entity. It is not a perfect representation of the person who gave it to you. And that's just my 2 cents.
100%. I agree. I'll end with I'll add to the catchphrase pile. One of my favorite catch or slogans or whatever axioms is the menu is not the mill, the map is not the territory. What we see up front is not the whole picture. And so we, both in the negative and the positive context, when we see a person, when we see their actions, we don't have their entire life. If you saw a person's entire life, it would be your entire life too, to take it in. It's one of those things where when you think about it, it's like one of the great boundaries that art may never be able to overcome is the fact that we are conscious entities in our own body, and we can only share through language, at least right now, who knows, but right now we can only share through language our experience. Beyond that, there is terabytes upon terabytes of information of experience that we will never be able to know or see or feel because of that limitation. Maybe one day technology will allow us to link brains with people and see their memories or whatever, but for now, we exist in this place where we have to, it is important to remind ourselves constantly that in any given situation, whether that's a person, whether it's a piece of media, whether it's a fact or a piece of news, you're only ever getting the initial face value of it. And behind that,
the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. Behind that is a whole, slew of stuff you cannot, it's just almost impossible to know everything about. So I say that to say, part of forgiveness comes from the idea of, I could be in that situation too. It could be me making that same mistake, or it could be me who is on the receiving end of that, and I might want to forgive. Everybody reacts differently to all kinds of consequences that happen in life. There isn't just one reaction, one absolute reaction to any horrible thing that happens to life. There are people who experience war, and they can have a positive point from that point on in their life because they don't want to see that happen again. But there are people who experience war and have a negative outlook because they don't know, they all they want to do is protect themselves from that. Both are very realistic reactions to the same thing.
Yep.
So anyway, my point being, when we go into the future, let's go with the sympathy and compassion that comes from the understanding that we are all animals in the middle of this very big ornate thing. I was gonna say zoo, make it conspiratorial, but no, it's
where the aliens are just kind of watching. I love that. Did you see that a couple weeks ago that there was that, I think it was an Iranian scientist came forward and said that there are aliens, but they don't want to expose themselves because we're a hot mess right now, and they don't want to add to it.
The Israeli rocket scientist, yes.
The aliens are right, guys. We need to get our shit together. On that note, we're going to wrap up. I just wanted to point out one last thing. I talked to the fans about it, and I just wanted to say, because this is an art-centric podcast, to the artists out there who have fucked up, are fucking up, are going to fuck up. You got this. Take a minute, step away from your art and realize that you are not your art, but you can also put yourself into art, and you can work on yourself through your art. And sometimes the best art that you will ever produce may not save you, but it might save someone who could do the same mistake that you did, or it could stop someone from making that same mistake or something like that. So you have opportunities in your failure, and I would encourage you to keep going, even if the likes, the retweets, the purchases, the arenas are empty. Whatever it may be, if everyone leaves, you can pull a Van Gogh and just keep doing your shit, man. Because you never know who's going to benefit from it in the long run. So put your art first and keep going. That'll do it for me.
And Rainwater out. Talk to y'all later.